Good morning. Here we are in 20th century looking at photography. We're going to look at the photo succession, what's called raw photography, some pretty cool abstract photography, some experimental techniques that have found their way into Photoshop, photo reportage, and visionary photographers today. The first artist we'll consider is Alfred Stieglitz. He's an American that lived until 1946. His photo succession gallery that he ran was called 291. He was married to Georgia O'Keeffe, and that's who we see pictured here. O'Keeffe was a painter that we looked at in our Painting in the USA slideshow, and he took nearly 500 photographs of her. Some of them were sexually graphic. This particular photograph, I think the hands are really beautiful in. He edited a journal called Camera Work, and he presented the first United States exhibits of Matisse and many other European modern painters and sculptors. Edward Steichen was an American that lived a very long life, dying in 1973. He worked in Paris for a time, and he advised Stieglitz on which modern artist he should show at his 291 gallery. And this is Steichen's photograph of the Flatiron Building in New York City. Really cool image. Looks almost more like an etching than it does a photograph. Paul Strand was an American that died in 1976. He preferred undoctored photography. Paul Strand, out of all the artists we're looking at today, probably would have despised Photoshop the most. He pioneered the use of extreme close-ups in his photography, and he often arranged forms to suggest abstractions, but it wasn't made abstract by how he printed it, it was by how he photographed it, and that was the key for Paul Strand. Man Ray was an American who lived until 1977. He helped found the Dada movement with Marcel Duchamp. He was also associated with the Surrealists, and he developed a technique called solarization, which is the partial reversal of tones in a photograph. And that particular technique is a technique that you can apply as a filter in Photoshop today. And in addition to his photographs, like the one we see here with the really cool tears, or are they glass balls, or who knows what, he painted, he drew, he sculpted, and he made films. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy was an American who was born in Hungary, lived until 1946, a very influential teacher. And he advocated that fine art must be integrated with the total environment. You know, your entire house, if you've got art up, the furniture must be art, the art on the walls is art, it's not decoration. Everything's got to work together. He taught at the Bauhaus, that famous German art school, and he was a painter, sculptor, and writer in addition to being a photographer. Cool shadows, the way they play. I mean, they're really more the subject than anything else in this particular photograph. Alexander Rodchenko was a Russian, lived until 1956, started out as a constructivist painter who employed unusual points of view in his work. 1922, he abandoned painting. He's actually credited with coining the term non-objective, that type of art that makes no reference to anything in nature or anything in the natural world. In his work, he's known for an innovative use of light and shadows. In the mid-1930s, he returned to painting. So I think once you do some painting, it's kind of hard to put it away forever. Edward Weston was an American who died in 1958. He started as a commercial photographer, and in the 1920s he started to make stark images of nudes, sand dunes, and vegetables. And in those vegetables and nudes he explored the sensuality of shape and made very finely detailed images. His son, Brett Weston, was actually a very strong photographer as well. You look at this particular image of the bell pepper, you know, it almost looks as if it could be a person's back with their head down and their legs curled up. very cool abstraction that suggests something else. Eugene Atget, Frenchman, lives until 1927. He photographed the residents and the street life of Paris. A lot of people consider him to be the first modern photographer, in that in his work he explored just commonplace images. As a matter of fact, he never really considered himself an artist. I think a lot of people would take issue with that designation. Now, Bill Brandt is maybe my favorite photographer of all time, a British photographer who died in 1983. He explored a very wide range of styles and motifs. Now, his early work was more documentary in nature, just kind of exploring what life in London was like. And his later work focused on abstract nudes with extremely high contrasts of values. It was almost black, white, and nothing in between. One of the things I like most about Bill Brandt's work are his magnificent portraits, this being one of them. This is a portrait of the painter Francis Bacon. And if you get a sense that Bacon's work's a little spooky, you're on the right track. Dorothea Lange, an American who lived until 1965. Clearly, and no doubt you would recognize this image, that focused on the suffering caused by the Depression. Lange rendered the difficult lives of the poor with some dignity in her work. Now, this photograph, called Migrant Mother, depicts a woman who was only 32 years old at the time. She had 7 kids, and her crop had just failed, and you can see it all on her face. Walker Evans was another American photographer who lived until 1975. He worked for the historical section of the Farm Security Administration and went around the South documenting what life looked like. He usually used an 8x10 view camera, one of those old cameras that you see an artist put his head under the hood so that he can see to focus. And Evans' work is similar in nature to Edward Hopper's paintings that you might recall from our Painting in the USA slideshow. Henri Cartier-Bresson was French, born in 1908. He died in the early 21st century. Began his career as a Cubist painter, and he captured what he called the decisive moment in his photographs. You look at this particular photograph of Faulkner, where he's seeking to reveal an event or the person's inner meaning in this case. Look at the way the dog is stretched. The timing on the photograph is perfect. That is the decisive moment in this photograph. He also often employed odd croppings and very careful compositions in his work. Great, highly regarded photographer. Bernice Abbott was an American who lived until 1991, and she created a series of New York City street scenes with very dynamic compositions, and they're very angular and energetic photographs. This one kind of reminds me of my credo when I'm in New York City. I never look up. It designates you as a tourist if you're the one walking around looking at the tall buildings. Margaret Bourke-White was an American who lived until 1971. She worked for Fortune and Life magazines that were known for their classic photo essays, and she was taught by her teacher, Henry Luce, to make her images both beautiful and factual, and she opened the door for many female journalists. When you look at this particular image, beautiful and factual, you know, the men's faces tell the whole story, but then look at the dramatic contrast in those white and black pants. So it's beautiful and it's factual both. Ouija, what a great name. An American who lived until 1968. His real name was Arthur Fellig. I guess if you're Arthur Fellig, you might go by Ouija as well. And he usually chronicled the dark side of New York City. And he kept a police radio in his car. He was basically an ambulance chaser with a camera. Let me go find out where the crazy things are happening, pursue them, and then photograph them. Ansel Adams, almost everybody knows his photographs, an American that lived until 1984. And he took photographs of the American West for over 60 years. He was a conservationist and a mountaineer, and his photographs feature incredible texture and an absolutely unbelievable value range that range from lights to darks. And he advocated straight photography. He thought that the key element in taking any photograph was to get the proper exposure. If you get a great exposure, you don't have to do a lot of work in the darkroom, or today you wouldn't have to do a lot of work at the computer. Minor White is our last photographer to look at today. He was an American that lived until 1976, and he was influenced by many of the photographers that we've looked at today, and also by the poet Walt Whitman. And he turned landscapes and seascapes, like you see here, into abstractions that were very much like the work of the painter Clyfford Still, who we'll study when we get to the abstract expressionists.